Hello and welcome. We are back again, of course. And look who we've got this time in the studio. Saveen Reddy.
I'm back, folks. You can't get rid of me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Saveen, for taking the time. Folks, we're back here talking about Azure Data Lake. And if any of you are wondering, why are we back here again so soon? Well, the last one we did was almost a year back. And in this entire year, this Azure Data Lake team has introduced so many awesome capabilities that it really forced us to get back into the studio and record a completely new course. Now, that said, if you don't know anything about Azure Data Lake, this is not an incremental course. So we're going to start right from the basics, and we're going to drive you through all of the capabilities in addition to some of the awesome new capabilities and focus on them a lot more. Now, to guide us through this entire course, we've got Mr. Azure Data Lake, Saveen Reddy. Saveen, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks for that introduction, Nishant. My name is Saveen Reddy. I've been at Microsoft 20 years, and the last 5 of them in the Azure Data Lake team. So my team is responsible for many aspects of Data Lake, but one of my key responsibilities is making sure the community of developers and users know what it is, how they can get value out of it, and how to literally develop on the system.
Certainly. And just to introduce myself, I'm Nishant Thacker. I'm a technical product manager for the big data and analytics capabilities at Microsoft. And I'm going to be your host throughout this entire course, right? So stay tuned. We've got a lot of awesome things that we're going to talk about and show you a lot of capabilities via demonstrations. And I've literally got Saveen to agree that we're going to have more demos than theory during this entire course.
Absolutely.
So let's get started with the first module here, Saveen, which is on Introduction to the Azure Data Lake.
You got it.
So can you tell me a little bit about what these services are and what are they meant to do?
Sure. Let's take a little step back and talk about doing big data in Azure. There are 3 broad ways you can get this done. The first is you, as a user, can create a cluster of virtual machines, install Hadoop software on them, and you take on the burden of managing and operating and patching and making sure all the compatible software is installed. That's challenging.
Certainly.
Right? I mean, it's almost as challenging as having a bunch of machines on premises, right? Okay, so that's one option. That's the most challenging. The second is using HDInsight. Insight. Now, HDInsight Insight is a service that brings you big data clusters. Hadoop, MapReduce, Spark, Storm, HBase. And the key thing about that is we have simplified some aspect of this. So now, of course, we manage the VMs. We patch them. We make sure that the compatible versions of Hadoop software are installed, right? They have an SLA. We have a support system for all that. And so if you are somebody who's looking to move from on-premises Hadoop and do big data in Azure in the cloud, this is great for you, right? And you get to use your Hadoop expertise. It's just now in the cloud, right? This is just normal Hadoop.
Yep.
Now, that can still be challenging. What if you're not a Hadoop expert? You're not familiar with all these terms like Spark and MapReduce, right? You're more maybe a standard corporation that uses SQL.
Yeah.
Right? And this is new stuff for you.
Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of those enterprises around the world.
That's a big audience of people, right? Who don't know about MapReduce and Spark. How can we make things simple, right? And what we truly believe is for the vast majority of people, the simplest way of getting onto big data is not by clusters, which are very useful, actually. There's a place for clusters in the world, but it's by offering big data as a true platform as a service. And that is our first service in Azure Data Lake Analytics.
Awesome.
Right? A true big data service. There's no clusters whatsoever.
So what I'm hearing over there is, if you're somebody coming from the open source world and you're well versed with the so-called all the animals in the zoo, then you can party on HDInsight Insight clusters because it brings you all the capabilities of the open source goodness on big data. But if you're somebody who's just wanting to get started and does not want any friction in terms of administering, managing, or even understanding the architecture of the clusters, you can just get started and hit the ground running with a service in the PaaS mode or as a job service with something like Azure Data Lake Analytics.
Absolutely. Another key thing there is you might be concerned about the cost, whether it be on premises or in the cloud, of maintaining a cluster and paying for it even though you're not using it. A true PaaS service like Data Lake Analytics, you only pay for exactly what you use.
Certainly.
Okay, and that's one of the key benefits.
What's the second piece of there?
So let's now broaden about and talk about Azure Data Lake. So Azure Data Lake isn't a thing.
Yeah.
It's a name that describes several services.
Yeah.
Now one of them is in fact HD Insight. That's part of our team. That's part of what we, that's part of the lake.
Azure Data Lake is the umbrella under which HD Insight, Data Lake, and...
So we talk about, in this umbrella, form factors for big data. One of the form factors is clusters, and there's a place for that. That's HD Insight, right? There's another form factor for doing analytics, which is, again, the true service form factor, the job service, some people call it. And so that's Data Lake Analytics. So both of these services, one is a cluster service, one is basically a query service or a job service, a true PaaS service. They perform analytics. And then we have a big data service that's focused on storage, and that's called Data Lake Store. Right?
Now the Data Lake Store, can you elaborate a little further on that, Saveen? Is that what we call the underlying HDFS? Is that our version of HDFS? Is that something that we could leverage across both of those services?
Yeah. So it's and that's why it's positioned in the middle between these two.
Certainly.
Right? It is a common big data store that can be used by HD Insight and Azure Data Lake Analytics and other services as well.
Right.
Put all your data in Data Lake Store, especially when it's meant for analytics, and all these analytics services can use them.
Certainly. And of course, we're going to talk much more about the Azure Data Lake Store and talk about how it differentiates from other stores in the market today and what is the value proposition of having a specialized analytics store as such, and why do we kind of go ahead and visualize something like this sitting very importantly under the Azure Data Lake umbrella. But I'm going to poke you a little bit on a point that you made a little while back, Saveen. You said Azure Data Lake is a PaaS service, and it's easy to get started on.
Yes.
So now, can you just show us what's the value proposition there?
Absolutely.
How can we hit the ground running with something like Azure Data Lake?
So this theme we called start in seconds, scale instantly, and pay per job. And it is a very quick process, okay? I'm talking about something that takes between about 30 seconds per service. So in between a minute, maybe a minute 30 seconds, you'll be doing big data in Azure.
Wow.
And that's very fast, and you'll be productive, okay? So we're gonna do a demo that shows you exactly how easy this is. Very simple.
Really nice. So let's dive straight into the demo there, Saveen.
Got it. Okay, Nishant. Now, what I am showing now is a Microsoft Edge browser. You can use Chrome too. And I'm browsing to portal.azure.com.
Certainly.
Okay. Now, I already have my dashboard filled out with things, right? So what I'm going to do is just create a new dashboard, just to make sure something's empty. So you're seeing everything that's going to happen.
Yep.
Okay, great. Now let's see how fast I can get started. The things to notice are what questions I have to answer, how much planning I have to do, how many numbers I have to type in,
Okay.
how many clicks,
Yeah.
okay? Do I have to make commitments for cost?
And you're taking us on the challenge of 30 seconds per service there,
Yes,
all right?
yes.
Let's just make sure we understand that.
Okay, so I'm going to click New,
Okay.
just like you would any other Azure service. Now you can search for it in the marketplace, but normally I just navigate Intelligence plus Analytics.
Of course.
And then down here, you'll see Data Lake Analytics, and you'll see Store as well. Now, just to make sure it's clear for everyone, I just have to create the Data Lake Analytics. The Store will come as part of this process. So both will appear. So I click on Data Lake Analytics. All Data Lake Analytics accounts just need a name. So I'll just enter some string, which I'll type in Saveen And it has to be all lowercase, so let me retype that, Saveen R. And I'll give today's date, 2017, 02/16. Okay, so there's no other service has been created with that name, so it's okay. Now, I need to be in a subscription.
Of course.
Okay. Now, it's going to show a list of subscriptions here.
Yeah.
Okay, these are all the ones I'm a member of, and it knows I'm a member of those subscriptions because, I have logged into the portal. As you can see on the upper right-hand corner, I've logged in as saveenr@microsoft.com.
Certainly.
Okay.
And if customers, like whoever's seeing this, if you're seeing just one of these subscriptions for yourselves, you just see one of those listed in that drop-down list. And if you're a member of multiple of them, you'll see that drop-down list populated with all.
So this one has defaulted to the one I prefer to use, which is one meant for training. Okay, so that's good. So far I've typed in one thing. Okay, and I've let it set. I've picked the default subscription. Now everything in Azure is a resource, and everything in Azure that is a resource is in a resource group. So I can pick a new one, pick an existing one, or create a new one. It's easy to create a new one. You just pick any name you want.
Certainly.
So I'll actually copy and paste that very same string, and I'll put in the word RG, just to designate it's a resource group.
Of course.
Okay, so it's going to be created. Now it has to be in a location.
Yep.
Now currently, we are in 2 locations, Central US and East US 2. I'll just leave it as East US 2. And there'll be more regions as time goes on.
Of course. Buddy tells me we're going into the European region very soon.
Yes, very shortly we will be in Europe.
Awesome.
Yes. Now, the pricing tier is set as pay-as-you-go. That means, again, only when I'm using it will I have to pay. I can change this, if I want to other tiers. So for example, if I know I'm going to spend some money every month, it's cheaper for me to pick up a monthly plan.
Of course. Now, just to elaborate that a little bit here, Saveen. So this is important for everybody to understand. Azure Data Lake as a service is designed for you to pay only for the time that you're using that service.
Yes.
And not pay for the time that you have the cluster up and running or anything like that.
There is no cluster.
Absolutely.
It's not like we're doing a service and creating small clusters behind the scenes.
Yes.
There's no cluster that you can interact with.
Certainly. And just to make that clear, like we'll get into that a little later as well, but right now, since we're creating that account, I want to make it clear that you only pay for the duration that a job, or in our sense, a query, is actually running on Azure Data Lake. So,
and the amount of compute you're using during that time.
absolutely. Yes, that's important. So you have the liberty to scale in terms of allocating more number of compute, and then you pay for the number of compute by the minutes or the hours that your query is actually running only. So since there's no cluster, you're not paying for any additional time for those clusters to stay up and running. And that's important. Okay.
Okay, so again, I've entered a name for the Data Lake Analytics account. I've entered the resource group. I need to designate a store. Every Data Lake Analytics account must have a Data Lake store.
Certainly.
It's default Data Lake store.
Yep.
So I'm going to click here on Data Lake store. Now, it's going to list all the Data Lake stores in all the subscriptions. It's a big list.
Yep.
But instead of picking one, which would make this demo go faster, I'm going to do it the hard way. Right? I'm going to create a new one, and let's just see how hard it is.
All righty.
I click on Create a New Data Lake Store, and I need a name. Now, of course, it has already copied in the name from the previous Analytics account, and it's appended ADLS at the end. So the name's typed in.
Okay.
Okay, so there's 3 strings now have been entered by me, so 3 choices I've made.
I can choose to change it if
You
I
can
want
change,
it.
absolutely, absolutely. And then pricing is also pay-as-you-go, but I can drop it down. If I needed to, I can pick monthly plans I want to. We'll leave it pay-as-you-go, okay?
Again, the same thing applies over here. So the amount of data that you bring into the store is the only amount that you pay for.
Exactly right.
You do not pay for anything blanket or anything as a default or something.
That's right.
Unless you choose to go in a commitment pricing model where you say, okay, I'm going to get so much data in this month, but can you give me a discount if I could take that particular
And it's
tier?
in your best interest to do that. And by the way, you don't have to make the choice now.
Of course.
Once you create the account, you can change it.
Certainly.
Okay.
All right.
So one more thing, encryption settings. Notice it says encryption settings enabled. By default, all Azure Data Lake stores are transparently encrypted, obviously on the wire, and also this means on the disk.
Yep, of course,
Right?
at rest.
You can disable this if you want to, but it's enabled by default, and that's a recommended practice. Okay. So I'll click OK. Now this OK does not create the store; it just has entered the fields for the name, et cetera, right? Okay. The final thing I'll do is click Pin to Dashboard, which means that there'll be a little tile on this dashboard that represents the status of this thing.
Certainly.
Okay. So I'm going to click Create,
Yep.
and you're going to see some things happen. But when I click Create, the key thing to remember is 2 accounts will get created. First a store, then an analytics account, and they'll be linked together. All analytics accounts must have a store account.
Yep.
Okay? And if I did nothing for the next year, the bill would be 0 for both.
Certainly. So
Okay.
the accounts are free.
The accounts are free.
Unless you use them to
Only
either
if
run
you use
jobs
them
or store data or whatever.
Yeah. So I'll hit Create. And what you'll see is a little toast here, as we call it, and it's saying submitting for deployment.
Of course.
And it takes about 30 seconds per service, so about a minute. Sometimes it can go a little higher, maybe a minute and 30.
Certainly.
But typically speaking, in a minute, it'll get
All right.
done. Right.
Now, while that happens, Saveen, I actually have a question. You pointed out a couple of times that a Data Lake Analytics account must have a default Data Lake Store account.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Now, why is that needed? Like, do we store any kind of metadata for the analytics account on the store account? How do we associate them? Is there a root folder that gets created? Is there some default mapping that's happening for individual jobs that you're running on top of it? Could you just tell us a little more about that?
So the sort of the easy way of thinking about the reason this is true
Yeah.
is there's two big reasons. Number one, think about this. We don't have a cluster, okay? When you run a big data job and it has log files that it's generating,
Yep.
where would they go? Well, they have to go somewhere.
Certainly.
Okay, so that's part one. They go to this default store. That's one usage. Okay. The second usage is basically we're going to use the store for other purposes. So, for example, and it won't be obvious until later in this course, you can store files there, input-output files.
Yeah.
Right. Also, when you use the U-SQL catalog, which is where you put structured data, the real data for the structured data is also stored in this Data Lake store. And the metadata for it is stored somewhere else, right? So job logs, and then also this kind of structured data, the U-SQL catalog.
Nice.
It won't be so obvious right now, but later on it'll see what I mean.
Certainly, yes. We'll get into a lot of the SQL pieces, and at that point in time, we'll get to realize what's the importance of that default store over there. But in the meantime, I think it didn't take us even a minute.
Yeah, it didn't take long.
And
so we're ready to go now. We actually submit a job now.
Absolutely.
So let's just try. Now, this looks like a very boring thing. There's no jobs have run, no compute hours have been used.
Certainly.
Of course, right? But let's explore this a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, let's just run a script. Okay.
Of course.
Now, we don't have any sample data in the account, but fortunately, we've made this simple for people. Click on sample scripts. Now, it's telling me two things.
Yep.
Now, the key thing here is sample data is missing. If you click this, in just a few seconds, we'll copy some data over there. So then we're ready to party. You can actually submit a script and try something.
So
we have some pre-built scripts here.
That's really important over there. Like, to get started on a Hadoop cluster or some of the other clusters, you'd actually be spending some time to potentially upload or ingest some data, etc. And this whole process has been made easy to get you started really fast. So we've provisioned some sample scripts and some sample data to run those scripts on. And on the click of that button, you're actually provisioning that data in your
It's copied over
default
to your account.
ADLS account.
And one more thing, that you see something that says U-SQL Advanced Analytics. Let's ignore that for right now.
Okay.
But the key thing here is, in order to get the samples to work, I had to click on something. This will change.
Yeah.
Shortly, these files and these capabilities will be in an account we will pay for.
Certainly.
So we'll have terabytes,
Yep.
hundreds of terabytes, a petabyte of data you won't be paying for.
Yep.
For use for big data, right?
Yes.
You'll just party on them, and we'll take on the burden of storing them for you. So this will no longer be a step.
Yep.
Okay, but let's try now a job. We have a few simple queries. We can explore the language.
Yep.
This is the very simplest job in our language called U-SQL. Now, what roughly speaking this job does is it reads from a tab separated value file, and then it writes to a tab separated value file, and essentially it's just doing a copy.
Okay.
Right? And you can see the script is asserting that this file has this schema. It's very simple. I don't want to go into the script because we're going to spend a lot of time on that later.
Yeah.
But I do want to show you this is how simple it is. If I click Submit Job, it will submit,
All right.
and it'll start running. But I just want to point out one thing. Remember I said we scale instantly and you pay per job? What did I mean?
All right.
take a look at this very innocent-looking slider that says AUs.
Wow.
AUs, roughly speaking, is an amount of compute power.
Right.
Right? It's an amount of storage, sorry, not storage, memory and cores.
Okay.
Okay.
And there are a number associated to it?
Yeah, we'll talk about that more. It's 6 gigabytes and 2 cores. So AUs are small units of processing power.
Yeah.
And you will pay for the duration of your job times the number of AUs.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you can see with 1 AU, I'm paying about 3 cents per minute. Now, this file that I'm reading and writing is only, I think, about 9K. Okay. And I can dial the number of AUs higher. In fact, I can dial it to 100.
Right.
Okay, which means 100 containers, AUs, will be reserved for this job. And I'll be paying now $3.33 per minute.
Of course.
Okay, now, we'll cover this later, but I just want you to think about this. It's pretty clearly not bad use of money for me to do this. It's not efficient. I'm wasting money. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I know it's AK.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
this
just
is a
copying
fundamental tension we have with doing big data. How are you efficient? How do you optimize? How can you save money doing this work? We have built-in tools that will help tell you what to dial the slider into.
Very nice.
Very sophisticated tools.
Now,
so you're not wasting
first
money.
is we made it so easy to just scale up the amount of compute that you can attribute to a particular query with the help of a slider. And the second is we made it intelligent enough to actually help you understand how many resources or how many AUs you should ideally be aligning to these kind of queries that come across. Now, of course, all of that's easy. And one more thing that you notice as part of the first sample script is the schema that we are doing over there is actually a schema on read. So remember, it's important for big data workloads since we are dealing with so many files, etc. And we'll dive into that in a lot more detail later on during the course. So Saveen, let's fire up that query.
And before I do that, I just want to make sure I did cover AU means analytics unit.
Of
I don't think I
course,
actually said that. So, you dial in the number of users. And I do want to make one more point. I can dial it up to 100. And I can run multiple jobs that go to 100. Okay. Now, why it goes to 100 for me is I'm a Microsoft employee. And we have our own rules on how these are used. So there's an artificial limit I've created on my account that limits it to 100. Right? It's a Microsoft policy.
So in essence, what you're trying to say is if a customer actually wanted, they could scale it up to 10,000 and further on.
Customers don't have that restriction today. If a non-Microsoft employee logs in as whatever account and creates a Data Lake Analytics account, and their slider will go by default to 250.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that's a lot of containers,
of course.
A lot of AUs. And the next thing is, what if you need more? Okay, you call us up, we can increase it.
All right.
Now,
in essence, just open
here's
up
a great question.
Yeah.
Today, what are customers? We're a new service. What can customers dial it up to? The ones who have talked to us. Our largest customer today can dial up to 2,500.
Wow.
Okay, now here's a question. And the significance will come very shortly. In Microsoft, when we use our data lake, what can internally Microsoft dial this slider up to?
Okay.
Well, the largest job I've seen, this was 2 years ago, the slider went up to 88,000.
88,000 for a single job?
For a single job. And I think that went against 5 petabytes.
Wow. That was,
so
I want to see the job graph for that.
And these AUs, they get, when you submit the job, they get allocated at that moment. You pay for them as they run, and the minute the job done, they go away, you don't stop paying. Very critical to how this works.
Right. Just to re-emphasize, 88,000 means 88,000 into 2 cores and into 6 gigs of memory, which essentially means a humongous amount of compute that we attribute if you need to for your job. So bring in whatever size big data you have to Azure Data Lake, and we've got something to give you, to cater to you in terms of compute and storage power.
Now, I showed a little bit of the compute part. One other thing I want to focus on is how we integrate with your environment.
Right.
And this is Active Directory. I'm going to add you, Nishant, as a user.
Okay.
Okay. Add user wizard, and I'm going to type in your name. Yeah, and you're one of these Nishants.
Of course I am.
Okay. And now, okay, I can pick you and add you, but I'm not going to do it right now. But here's what I'm trying to illustrate. When I created the account, did you ever see me type in anything about Active Directory?
Nothing at all.
Nothing. It's automatically integrated. right?
Yep.
So I can pick users and groups here to be developers on this account,
Right.
right? Very integrated.
Very
Very
nice.
integrated, very simple. This is much harder to do in other systems.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you logged in with an identity to your Azure Active Directory into the subscription, and it attributed the accounts that you created to be part of the same Azure
That's
Active
correct.
Directory
That's
automatically.
correct. Automatically.
Because it understood that you wanted to collaborate with your colleagues
Absolutely.
in making sure they leverage the wonderful work that you could do with Azure Data Lake.
Absolutely.
Insane stuff.
Okay.
All right. So are we gonna go ahead and fire up that job now?
We will take a look at that job shortly.
Okay.
I will go ahead and first submit it.
Nice.
Right. So let's go and take a look and sample scripts, and let's go ahead. So you can see from it what it looks like. So the job will be compiled. That's this preparing phase. It won't run very long, and you'll see a very simple what we call a job graph. We will explain what the job graph means later. And there's a lot of tooling here that isn't obvious.
Yeah.
As we discover U-SQL programming, we'll go into a little more depth. Okay.
This is great. So we're just waiting for that job to complete now. As we get there, I want people to also notice the fact that there are some phases in that job now. Again, we'll dive much deeper into that, just getting our feet wet over here right now. But as we get into that, like, there is some amount of processing that happens. There is some amount of tooling that's present. And we even go ahead and publish a job graph for you to look into to go ahead and determine if there are any bottlenecks, etc. Now, we will definitely dive into the job graph in much more detail also. But as we see, like, that job has already completed. That file or a set of files, if we wanted inside of a container to be copied with a read-only or schema on read kind of modality, is now happening with the simplicity of a simple SQL-like query that you can write on top of your data. Let's look at the job complete.
Yeah, so it's running. Again, it's a very small job.
Yeah.
Now, notice it went through several phases: preparing, queued, running, finalizing.
Yeah.
The key one to focus on is running. That's how many seconds you're actually charged for.
Okay.
So one AU for 17 seconds.
Right.
Now, some of you will be wondering, hey, it's funny, preparing, that is compiling, took 18 seconds. Why should that be? It seems large.
Yeah.
The first thing is, compilation is a very complex process, because this is designed for massive queries.
Yes.
Now, this is when you want 100 terabytes.
Yes.
This is not a system to talk about kilobytes
Yes.
or megabytes,
Yes.
right? So it's a big engine you've invoked for this. And we will go into much more detail about what is actually happening in compilation. But the key thing is it's not actually a long compilation when you think about what you really should be doing with the service, which is 100 terabytes, 500 terabytes, a petabyte.
Of course.
Right, okay. Okay, so that is our demo of how you get started quickly. And we've explored a little bit about how a job will run and the phases of a job in the system.
I know. And you certainly lived up to the promise of that 30 seconds per service.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Insane. So let's just get back to a little more on the kind of Azure Data Lake know-hows before we dive into some of the more detailed modules there, right, Saveen?
Okay. So there's an important point I need to make about Data Lake. I mentioned a little bit earlier, I hinted at it. What's the biggest someone in Microsoft can dial a slider up to?
Of course.
Okay. So Microsoft has an internal data lake.
Yep.
Right? It is called Cosmos. It's not a secret. We've talked about it. We don't talk about it very much.
Yeah.
Because it's, but you can think about it as the initial version, our internal version of Azure Data Lake.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more primitive,
Yeah.
but man, we have scaled it out.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the graph on the right, it's from 2010 to 2016.
Right.
Now, I can't give you the exact numbers,
Yeah.
but I will say this. On the far left is 64 petabytes in 2010. We're at multiple exabytes on the far right in 2000. And that's for 2016. It's an old number. You can see growth has not diminished. Now, you may see here also we have many teams. Yes. All of Microsoft. Microsoft runs on this internal version of Azure Data Lake. It's absolutely true. Okay?
Certainly is.
Hundreds of thousands of physical machines. Many hundreds of thousands of AUs.
Of course.
Tens of millions of batch compute hours a day. It does batch compute, it does streaming, it does machine learning, it does interactive queries.
Of course.
Millions a day.
Yeah.
The real number is the number of unique people actually. So we measure the number of unique developers every month that are writing U-SQL code, our internal version of U-SQL. It's actually, this number's old. It says 10,000. It's actually closer to 12 or 15,000.
Yep.
Writing big data code
I know.
in the system.
Yep.
So when we talk about building Data Lake as a product, what we're saying is we have learned how to scale a big data system, and not only to make the numbers work out for scale, how does it scale for people? Right. How can you get developers of all abilities, novices, intermediates, experts, data scientists, to be productive on the system, on all data? Yeah. That's the number we're really focused on. Azure Data Lake, we want it to be easy and productive for developers.
Certainly. I mean, the other thing that I want to highlight is I've read research papers on this internal Azure Data Lake published by Microsoft Research back in the day when I was in college. The point I'm trying to make over here is we've not done this today. This has been in place for years now, and it has matured and hardened in a sense that it can cater to the most robust requirements of an enterprise data lake. And now is when we've decided to give our customers the advantage of leveraging on top of our experience and the matured platform that we have in place.
And so Data Lake, there's a great question. Is Data Lake the same thing as Cosmos?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and actually, so it is true, they actually share code.
Yeah.
That is a fact, right?
It
is true that sometimes they don't share code. There are some aspects of Data Lake which are completely rewritten.
Of course.
They're rewritten so they can run in Azure, right? There are more features actually in Data Lake in some sense.
Yeah.
So, but the key thing to understand here is, we are committed to Azure Data Lake. Why? Yeah. Microsoft itself is moving to Azure Data Lake.
Of course.
We're going to do all our big data on Azure Data Lake.
Now, that brings me to a few questions here, Saveen. Like, we use the term Azure Data Lake, and I know we explained that Azure Data Lake was more of an umbrella, but still people just tend to associate that to be like the store of all the data that's coming in without any analytics capability. So I want you to spend a little more time on the store aspect of the Azure Data Lake as well as we get into it, and try and explain like why is that needed in the first place, what is it, and how does it cater to what we call the analytics store requirement.
So I'll keep this short. The Azure Data Lake store, it's in some sense it's kind of easy to create a store that stores a lot of data.
Certainly.
Many people have done it. That's not where the challenges are.
Yeah.
Okay. The challenges are making a store that an enterprise can use, that does the auditing and security and compliance, that meets those needs, does it, reliably, right, and can scale out to any size of data and it's easy for developers to use. Right. So let me give you an example. The first thing we say is, in some stores in the cloud, you have to think about container sizes and account sizes and how many files you can have, how big a file can be. We actually work in a world in Data Lake Store of no limits. So for example, if you have a petabyte-sized file, you don't in Data Lake wonder, oh, how can I chop it up into pieces and put it in different containers and accounts? That's all here. We just do it.
Yep.
And just in case I'm sure you're wondering, have we ever created a petabyte-sized file? Yes.
Multiple.
Multiple, yes. By the way, does Microsoft ever actually use a petabyte-sized file? Yes. I think the largest file I saw a couple of years ago was 800 terabytes. That's 7 trillion rows of data. But it was being used by Bing.
Okay.
So yeah, such files exist. It's relatively esoteric, but you can do it. Right?
And that's just what we've seen. Like we've seen jobs getting fired against multiple petabyte-sized files or multiple petabyte-sized data as well in that space.
Absolutely.
Right. And the other piece from the Azure Data Lake Store perspective is also that these analytics capabilities actually have a requirement for peculiar amount of throughput out of their storage environments.
That's the other thing. Storing something, again, is kind of simple.
Yeah.
Giving you enough I/O throughput, parallel region writes is another topic. So this is why we talk about Azure Lake Store as being optimized for analytics.
Yeah.
You could, store a movie there or just archive data. Yeah. But that's not where you're going to get the most value. You're going to get the value up by processing the data there.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yes. And this flows through for all the services that can leverage the Azure Data Lake Store. And the Azure Data Lake Store as a whole is like opened up as a web HDFS layer. So if you have tools that are kind of utilizing analytics in its truest form and you want to make sure you leverage a big data store, the Azure Data Lake store is the store that you want to take account of over here. So in the Azure world, HD Insight, Azure Data Lake Analytics, both take immense advantage of the no limits to scale as well as the immense high throughput that the Azure Data Lake store offers.
Now, one more thing is that obviously Azure Data Lake has its origins in our internal big data system, but I told you it's different. And one of the ways it's different is it's built on open source technology. One of those pieces is web HDFS.
Of course.
This is critical. What that means is the Data Lake store, for all intents and purposes, will look, act, and as just any other HDFS store, right? And that means that existing open source technologies that know how to use HDFS and web HDFS will just work with it.
Of course.
Right? That's it's a big advantage. Very important. That's how, in fact, we get HD Insight to work with Data Lake Store and other tools.
Yep, and I like to call it HDFS on steroids. Like with no limits, just gone beyond anybody's imagination.
Now, Data Lake Analytics, now, we talked already about scaling it up, right? Data Lake Analytics, which is what we did the demo on, the things I want to emphasize here are that it's about writing big data programs, okay? And the primary language you'll do that in is U-SQL. I showed you a tiny snippet of that, right? Yep. And those programs can run against gigabytes if you want, but even petabytes. It's one language that scales in all dimensions, okay? And it's not just a matter of being able to write programs. Things get really difficult when things go wrong. What happens if one of the containers in our Azure environment has to reboot? What happens if your code, your C# code, throws an exception? What happens if your job is running slower than you'd like it to be?
Exactly.
How do you solve those problems and figure them out? We have made it very easy to do that in the system, like dramatically easy. And we will show demonstrations of that later in this training. And the other thing, Data Lake Analytics, we sort of talk about Data Lake Store and Analytics as being paired, right? But I don't want to overemphasize that. Data Lake Analytics can actually can read data from multiple cloud data sources. So today it's Data Lake Store, Windows Azure Blob Storage, SQL Data Warehouse, SQL Database. And in the future, we will increase the number of Azure cloud stores that it can read from.
Certainly. Now, the other piece, Saveen, that always comes up in this world is like, what are the kind of workloads and scenarios that you're going to look at this? Now, again, this ties back to essentially what some of the big data workloads in its truest sense mean, and how does Azure Data Lake play into those big data workloads as they come into the existence?
Okay. So, the normal set of workloads people will talk about are batch, streaming, interactive, and machine learning.
Of course.
So Data Lake Analytics today, our first drop of it is focused on batch processing, okay, for big data. Interactive, machine learning, and streaming are coming. We're actively working on them. They will come. And so, given that we're batch today, right now, what are the kind of things we see customers actually doing with it? Okay. So there's 4 things I would point out. Number one, they're using it in an ETL type sense to just transform, fix up, normalize data. That's the bread and butter of big data processing. A lot of logs are being processed. A lot of sales orders are being normalized, right?
Rather, like you said, ETL, I'd rather say it's an ELT process.
ELT, okay, yeah, that's fair. That's
because you load everything up and then you're using tools within U-SQL with the capabilities of the language to go ahead and transform the data and derive information from it rather than just doing an ETL process of a pipeline or orchestrating some things over there.
The second class of thing is you do want to do just simple analytics, right? But the data you're processing on is just really large, right? Like you could do this in SQL with a normal SQL query, but like it can handle 500 terabytes of data.
Of course.
So people do that here. So this is like weekly or monthly reports when you're looking at hundreds of terabytes of data.
And the important differentiation over there with SQL is more around like, how do we scale it out? Because we know that we're using analytics units. And each of those analytics units is a different container in itself or a different compute capacity in itself. So how do you pick up a query and break it up into smaller chunks to be executed across that scale-out architecture that you've got access to now? And how do you do some high-performance compute operations on top of all of these compute resources that you have access to? Now, Saveen mentioned SQL. SQL is wonderful, but it's a single server mode. It does not scale it out. And that's why the need for U-SQL, which is internally taking a query and understanding the heuristics of it to go ahead and chunk size the query to be executed across these individual compute nodes. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next scenario is you're writing massively parallel programs. U-SQL, I said, does write massively parallel programs,
Of course.
But sometimes you want to extend it to use other kinds of analytics. So for example, and we will show this later as well, what if you wanted to train thousands of models using R? Or in the middle of U-SQL, use Python, because you're familiar with libraries like NumPy and Pandas. So U-SQL actually allows you to distribute Python code out to run on these AUs, these containers, as well as R code.
Which is brilliant, which means now we can bring in real complex machine learning models, which were just executing or getting trained on very small amounts of data because you did not have the right set of capacity to do that, irrespective of what environment they are on. And now you can bring them all inside of Azure Data Lake with your SQL and train them on petabytes of data.
And just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is, there's two kinds of problems. You want to train on petabytes of data as one aggregate sort of data set. This case I'm really talking about is you want to train on many petabyte data, but it's lots of small pieces. Right?
Certainly.
So that's the piece. It's massively parallel.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And finally, and that, by the way, that was a new feature that just came into the product. Very excited, and there's much more we're going to add to it.
Of course.
Is performing cognition at scale. You may have heard about these cognitive APIs.
Yes.
Right?
Of
So a
course.
REST
It's so
call,
exciting.
you can do things like, was it face detection, emotion analysis?
No, yeah.
And
Text analysis, face detection, speech detection.
And so those are REST services,
Yeah.
right? And you pay for that. U-SQL has these cognitive features built in,
So,
right? So we actually have a subset of the cognitive features built into U-SQL. You remember when I showed you the sample query and I said install U-SQL Advanced Analytics?
Yes.
If I clicked that button, it would have installed this feature. In the future, it'll be auto-installed.
Of course.
Right?
Yes.
And so you can do these things. And here's the cool thing. With the cognitive services, of course, you pay for them, right?
Yep.
In U-SQL, when you use them, the cost is baked into using U-SQL. There's no separate cost for it.
Yeah.
Right? So you can take advantage of all our models of text analysis and image recognition and analysis without incurring an extra cost. You're already paying for it as part of running these AUs.
Yeah. Just for everybody to wrap your heads around this, like cognitive services are an output of some of the most advanced research that's come from Microsoft research teams. Now we offer those as APIs as well, which you can tap into with the help of REST APIs, and you can derive information from there. Now what we've done as part of Azure Data Lake is take those models and put it into each and every compute node that your query or a chunk of your query is getting executed on. So when you click on that advanced SQL capability, that's what's happening. So now you can just push the amount of data that you want to process in that compute node, take advantage of the existing models in that compute node, or that AU as we refer to it, or the container as Saveen's been referring to it all this while. And you can derive intelligence at scale from all of those models that are already present over there. Now, the next point, Saveen, I have a question on is like, can you elaborate on that with the help of some scenarios? Like, how does this actually play out?
Yeah. So, I have this diagram. It's a very simple diagram, but it more or less captures what's happening today, all right? So what you see is people, and this is actual customers, right, of Data Lake. They're moving data into the Data Lake, into the Data Lake store, obviously, first, via tools like Azure Data Factory, or manual tools like our PowerShell tools. But mostly the data is coming through Azure Data Factory, through the copy activity. And then it's there in a raw form, okay? And then what they're using is they're cleaning it up, transforming it, with Data Lake Analytics.
Nice.
Okay, they're preparing the data, and that's again our first big center, is preparing data for use. And then what they might be doing, when the data's in the lake, the store, is doing machine learning with HD Insight on top of it. So again, an example of the data's one place and all the analytics can take advantage of it.
Right.
Okay, they might be training a model or whatever. And then what they're also doing is then using ADF or other tools to move the data either into services like SQL DW or SQL DB, which are then consumed by dashboards or portals, et cetera, or Power BI, or they're directly consuming the files with some of the same tools.
Right.
So that's today's scenario. As we onboard more workloads like the interactive, streaming, machine learning, how this picture will change is we expect you will do less movement of data out into things like SQL DW and DB.
Okay.
And the reason is very simple. You want to do analytics on a petabyte of data. It'll take you a long time to copy a petabyte of data. It will be better if you just leave it in one place and allow us to, will allow you to use our built-in analytics features like streaming and machine learning and interactive to process that data.
Of course, yes. So it's essentially taking the same principles. Take the compute to where the data lives,
That's exactly
bring
right.
the data to where the
right.
compute.
So we'll add those capabilities to where the data is.
Of course. Right. Now, elephant in the room, Saveen. We're talking about some of newer capabilities in the analytics space, and it's imperative for us in this introductory module to clear off the air on how do they stand against, or how do they even complement some of our existing analytics capabilities.
Sure.
So the first thing that I want you to talk about a little bit is, how does ADLA kind of complement HD Insight, or what are the kind of capabilities that they differentiate amongst themselves?
And I think mix and match is really the answer here. You pick what you need. The first thing is get your data in the store.
Yeah.
Okay? Because once you've made that decision, everything else is easy. So now how do you go either side? Let's start with HD Insight, the clusters as a service first. That's a good place for you if you're a Hadoop expert. If you already have a ton of code that's using Hadoop, open source libraries written in Java. If you are using Mahout, or you want to use specific tools in the open source ecosystem, right? So HD Insight is geared for that. Now, if you're using those tools, you're already an expert in big data in terms of Hadoop. So that's a good place for you to be. Okay.
And again, I'll draw the attention of the audience over here to HD Insight, which is our cluster-based PaaS service where we offer query-based clusters with Hive and Pig and all the other tools. We have edge-based clusters. We have streaming clusters with Storm. We have Kafka clusters as well. And of course, we have Spark clusters. So if you're comfortable with any of those open source ecosystem tools, you can definitely go ahead and leverage all of the awesomeness of a managed cluster environment and HD Insight and play or party on the data sitting inside of your Azure Data Lake store with any of these tools with its analytics capabilities sitting on top. Now, Saveen mentioned a very important point over there. Irrespective of what analytics capabilities you want, Data Lake Store happens to become your one point of data storage for all of your analytics workloads. So if you have data over there, you have all the capabilities to party on that data with the analytics tools of your choice. Let's dive a little deeper into Data Lake Analytics.
One more thing about that. Remember, recently SQL DW now can use Polybase to read from ADL store.
I know, yes.
So that's another example of analytics happening, and your data's in one place, right?
And that's something that we've just announced last week. So if you're not aware, SQL DW can now use Polybase to go ahead and query data sitting on Azure Data Lake Store. So another analytical capability, a data warehousing service sitting on top of the Data Lake Store now. So isn't that amazing how the whole world's converging together into a single umbrella now?
And now, so we talked about HD Insight.
Yep.
What about Data Lake Analytics? Okay, so if you're new to big data, obviously it will be far easier for you to try this. You certainly won't have the cost investment.
Right.
Okay. If you're an enterprise that knows SQL and knows you're .NET friendly, this is a great place for you to be. It's got much lower barrier to entry because a lot of what you already know is applicable still.
Right.
Right. The tooling is really great here. Right. Like we've had since 2008 to build this tooling. It's very advanced, and we'll show all that. Right. So everything's familiar, Visual Studio, familiar tooling like that, familiar concepts of SQL and C#, familiar, easy to get started, there's no commitment. And I would say we expect that the true platform as a service for big data is the long-term right approach. And for a long time, you'll see both being applied.
Of course.
And one thing I'll also say is, I talk about the improvements we have for tooling and things, and security, and being good for the enterprise and data lake analytics. Our team is also going to add some of those things back into the clusters.
Yeah.
We've already added some Visual Studio tooling to HD Insight.
Certainly.
Right? And VS Code as well. And we're going to make security better, make it more integrated with AAD. Yes. So both will get better.
Yes.
Right? And both have a place.
Yep.
Just keep your data in Data Lake Store.
Of course. Now, the other piece over there is we just teased a little bit on the SQL DW and the poly-based capabilities, but that's another set of service or another data warehousing capability that's sitting, which kind of has a little bit of an overlap with the kind of analytics that you perform in Azure Data Lake.
If you look at the surface of it, it might seem just really confusing, right?
Yeah.
Both services talk about petabytes of data. Both services scale out to many nodes. Both services have a SQL language, right? But I think it's actually more clear than it's ambiguous, right?
Of course.
First of all, let's be honest. If you are thinking about doing a lift and shift from your on-premises SQL DW to the cloud, SQL DW in Azure is the right choice.
Absolutely.
Right? It will be far easier to do that. If you really need full T-SQL compatibility, go there. If you really need to use all those tools that you love, like SQL Server Management Studio,
of course,
that's fully compatible with that thing. That's a great place to be.
Absolutely. Okay. So in essence, what we're trying to tell you is like the traditional world is going to really love the SQL DW service in Azure, where they bring in the similar set of tooling capabilities, they bring in a similar environment for you to go ahead and put your data in, and just to go ahead and lift and shift your existing workloads in a more cloud-borne environment sort of a place. Now, where do we use Azure Data Lake Analytics?
ADL is when you start lift and shift is a bad approach to go to ADL. Right? You're going to have to rethink things. Where is this interesting for you? What if your interest, and again, I talked about organizations that are familiar with C# and .NET and SQL, but they have some flexibility here. Like for example, they want to be more compatible and use technologies that are in the open source space. So for example, we talk about U-SQL today. In the future, we're talking about maybe doing other kinds of languages like Hive.
Probably.
In the same form factor, right? So that's a place, if you think that's going to happen, that's a good place to do it. Our scaling is a little different. We don't have DWUs, we have these AUs, as you saw, right? So we don't scale the same way, but as you can see, our scaling is massive, right? And instant. Interoperating with open source formats such as ORC, Parquet, right? That's a huge thing. That's the world of big data, right?
Yes.
And then finally, I mentioned before this massive parallelization of R and Python.
Yes.
Those are our scenarios, right?
Yes.
And then cognitive.
Yes, cognitive. Right? How can we miss that?
So these are very different kinds of scenarios.
Right.
Right. Having said that, if you are going to make a transition, you want to go from on-premises to the cloud. Yes, SQL DW would be the easiest lift and shift. I would ask anyone, think about the scenarios you're going to have, and maybe some pieces should move over.
Right.
Right.
And the other piece I think is important over here is like if you really want interactive response times from your queries, and those can be substantially large, you really want to get into the environment of SQL DW, because as Saveen mentioned a little while back, all this while we've been making sure that Azure Data Lake is absolutely plugged in terms of the batch analytics capabilities. Now, batch doesn't only mean that you're processing a query across the data. Batch also means if you want to go ahead and parallelize your machine learning or cognitive capabilities across that data. And very soon, we may have interactive capabilities in Azure Data Lake as well. But today, if you're really looking at Azure or interactive capabilities, SQL Data Warehouse happens to be the layer where you want to go ahead and kind of play around with. Now, that said, like a typical architecture is not going to be either or. It's going to be an and, where you want to offload some real tough, real huge amount of batch mode capabilities like you would do, let's say, throughout the night inside of a data warehouse to cater to your OLAP workloads, etc. All of that can now be offloaded to an environment like Azure Data Lake, with the data being ported or the processed and curated data being ported into the SQL data warehouse to be published and consumed via BI tooling or OLAP tools, etc., for your end user consumption. And that's important to understand. So it's not an either or, it's an and conversation with SQL Data Warehouse and Azure Data Lake.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, the other piece that we must address before we go any forward is definitely how does the Azure Data Lake store stack against the existing object store in the Azure world, which is Windows Azure Storage blobs?
So, we have a comparison table here, but I want to focus on probably the biggest difference, right? Which is blob storage is a more fundamental kind of storage service. It's built for building platforms, right? Azure Data Lake Store is much more like a directly usable by the end user and enterprise store.
Certainly.
Right? It is not meant for generic storage of bits, right? It has a certain view of the world, which is we have familiar things like there's an account with folders, and folders contain other folders and files. And we forcibly integrate with Active Directory,
of course,
right? We don't let you use things like with those access keys, right? We make sure everything's encrypted. Both services now encrypt on disk. We have an ACL model,
of course,
right? So if you want to do big data development and you want to experience something that's more sort of a normal way of dealing with files, especially files at scale, Data Lake Store is the place to be. If you're building a platform, like you're building a OneDrive, then really you want to use a storage platform that's built to support that scale. Right. Now it's not an issue of how much data you can put in. It's an issue of what your use case is.
Certainly.
Right. So that's how I would distinguish the two. And the other one is Data Lake Store is optimized for analytics. Right. And you're going to pay a little more for that, but it's optimized for compute.
Right. That's the important piece. The differentiation is it's not a generic object store. If you really want to bring in your OneDrive files and bring in all of those media files, etc., where you do not want to do any kind of analytics upon, the Windows Azure Storage Blob might be as sufficient as you can get. If you really want to go ahead and do some high throughput, high performance analytics on top of your data, the Azure Data Lake Store is the place to be because it's catered and it's designed ground up, keeping in mind those kind of workloads, right? With that, I think we've come to an end of this first module.
Yeah, let's just do a quick wrap up of what's going on. First of all, we showed the relationship between the three services, and, how to do big data in Azure as well. Then we went through and showed you getting started pretty fast. Right. Then we dived into some of the interesting differentiating factors of each service, and we did then some diffs. This service, HT Insight versus Data Lake Analytics, SQL Data Lake Analytics, and then the two kinds of stores we have, right? So you should, at the end of this module now, have a good sense of the landscape of what Azure Data Lake is and how it relates to other things in Azure.
Certainly. Feel free to post comments as part of the course as we're going along as well, and we're more than happy to answer those questions. But with this, it's a wrap on Module 1, and we're going to join you back again for the next module there.